On June 25th, something happened that looked small on the surface. A NATO official appeared on American television and spoke as if the Western alliance had just proven its unity. He suggested that American strikes against Iran had relied on European bases, including bases in Italy and Romania. Normally, that kind of statement is designed to send a message. It tells the world, America is not alone. NATO is united. Europe is still standing behind Washington. But within hours, Italy did something Washington did not expect. Italian officials came forward and denied it. Not quietly, not through anonymous sources, not through vague diplomatic language. They said clearly that Italy had not authorized participation in strikes against Iran. And that is where the real story begins. Because when an enemy denies your claim, that is normal. But when your own ally denies your claim in public on the same day during a war crisis, that is not a simple misunderstanding. That is a crack in the system. And at the exact same moment, something even more important was happening in the Gulf. Saudi Arabia, Qatar, the UAE, Kuwait, Bahrain, and Oman were not lining up behind Israel. They were welcoming diplomacy with Iran. Think about what that means. For decades, Israel and the United States worked to isolate Iran. They wanted the Arab Gulf states to see Tehran as the permanent enemy. They wanted a regional wall built around Iran. But now, in the middle of the crisis, those same Gulf states are quietly stepping away from confrontation. They are not doing this because they suddenly love Iran. They are doing it because they are calculating survival. Iran is their neighbor. Israel is a distant military power. America is powerful, but distracted, divided, and expensive to follow. And this is the part most media coverage misses. The question is not whether America can still bomb. Of course it can. The question is whether other countries still believe following America is safer than keeping distance from it. That belief is what empires depend on. Not just aircraft carriers, not just missiles, not just bases. They depend on aura. The aura that says if America gives an order, allies obey. But on June 25th, that aura was damaged. Italy hesitated, the Gulf recalculated. Iran used law and geography as weapons. Russia quietly profited. China quietly built for the next decade. So this is not just a story about Iran. It is a story about what happens when American power still looks massive, but the countries underneath it start asking a dangerous question. What if loyalty to Washington now costs more than distance from Washington? To understand why this matters, we have to begin with Europe, because the Italian denial was not just a diplomatic embarrassment. It revealed something deeper about NATO. For years, Washington has treated European territory as part of its global military machine. Bases in Italy, Germany, Romania, Greece, and elsewhere are not just defensive positions. They are launch pads for American power. That works as long as European governments can pretend the system is stable. But Iran changed the calculation because Tehran immediately framed the issue in legal terms. Iran's message was simple. If a country allows its territory to be used for aggression against Iran, that country is not neutral. It becomes part of the aggression. That is a very different kind of battlefield. Iran was not only responding with missiles or threats, it was forcing European governments to choose. Either admit involvement and risk legal and political consequences, or deny involvement and publicly separate yourself from Washington. Italy chose denial. And that choice tells us something important. When the cost of loyalty rises, allies start searching for escape doors. They do not always rebel openly. They do something more subtle. They create distance. They use careful language. They say, we were not consulted. We did not authorize. We were not part of this. This is how alliances weaken before they break. Not with one dramatic collapse, but with public contradictions, legal disclaimers, and quiet refusals. That is why the Italy moment matters. Because America did not lose a battle there. They lost something more delicate. They lost the automatic assumption that allies will absorb the consequences of American decisions. And once that assumption is gone, every future crisis becomes harder. But Europe is only one piece of this puzzle. The much bigger shift is happening hundreds of miles away in the Persian Gulf. For more than 4 decades, American strategy in the Middle East rested on one central assumption: keep Iran isolated. The idea seemed simple. If Tehran could be cut off from its Arab neighbors, its regional influence would slowly shrink. Without economic cooperation, without diplomatic support, and without normal relations with the Gulf monarchies, Iran would eventually find itself boxed in. Washington invested enormous diplomatic resources into making that vision a reality. Israel invested even more. The Abraham Accords were celebrated as proof that the strategy was finally succeeding. The UAE normalized relations with Israel, Bahrain followed. Saudi Arabia appeared to be moving cautiously in the same direction. Many analysts believed Iran's regional position was entering its weakest period in decades. Then everything changed. Instead of strengthening the coalition against Iran, the latest military confrontation produced the opposite effect. Rather than pushing Gulf governments closer to Israel, it reminded them of a simple geographic reality. Iran is not going anywhere. Wars end, governments change, American presidents come and go. But Iran will still be sitting across the Gulf. That reality forces every Gulf leader to think differently than politicians in Washington or Tel Aviv. Their first priority is not ideological victory. Their first priority is preventing regional chaos. Every missile fired across the Gulf threatens ports, oil terminals, shipping routes, insurance costs, investment flows, and tourism revenues. Even countries that disagree with Iran have no interest in watching the region become a permanent battlefield. That explains why the diplomatic language suddenly began to change. Instead of speaking about confrontation, officials increasingly spoke about dialogue. Instead of discussing pressure, they discussed stability. And instead of asking how to isolate Iran, many began asking how to prevent another regional war. Notice what changed, not their friendship, their incentives. This distinction matters. Geopolitics is rarely about emotions. States don't make decisions because they like each other. They make decisions because they calculate risk. From Riyadh to Doha, from Abu Dhabi to Muscat, leaders began asking one uncomfortable question. If another major conflict erupts tomorrow, who pays the price first? The answer was obvious. Not Washington, not London, not Brussels. The Gulf, their ports, their infrastructure, their economies, their populations. That is why many Gulf governments began supporting negotiations instead of escalation. It wasn't surrender. It wasn't choosing Iran over America. It was choosing stability over uncertainty. And that calculation has enormous consequences. Because once regional partners start believing diplomacy offers greater security than military alliances, the entire balance of power begins to shift. Washington noticed this immediately. Senior American officials rushed across the Gulf, holding emergency meetings with regional leaders. Officially, those visits were described as consultations. But look carefully at the language used. American officials repeatedly emphasized reassurance. That word reveals far more than most people realize. Strong alliances rarely require reassurance. Confident allies do not need constant reminders that everything is under control. Reassurance becomes necessary when confidence begins to weaken. When governments quietly wonder whether their partner can still guarantee the stability it once promised. That alone doesn't mean America's alliances are collapsing. But it does suggest something has changed beneath the surface. The conversations are no longer about defeating Iran. They are about managing uncertainty. And whenever uncertainty replaces confidence, every regional player begins preparing for multiple futures instead of betting everything on one alliance. That is exactly what we are watching unfold today. But while Washington was trying to preserve old alliances, Iran was introducing a completely different game. Instead of asking who supports us politically, Tehran started asking a far more practical question. Asterisk, who wants to make money? That may sound like a small shift. In reality, it changes the entire strategic conversation. For years, discussions about the Strait of Hormuz focused almost entirely on military threats. Would Iran block it? Would the US Navy intervene? Would global oil prices explode? Those questions still matter. But Iran added another dimension, economics. Rather than presenting the Strait only as a security issue, Iran began portraying it as an economic asset that neighboring countries could help manage and potentially profit from. Think about the logic. Nearly 1/5 of globally traded oil passes through that narrow waterway. Every tanker, every shipment, every disruption affects markets from Asia to Europe. Instead of saying we control this route by force, Iran began signaling something different. What if regional countries managed its security together? Whether that proposal succeeds or fails is almost secondary. The important point is that Iran changed the conversation. Instead of debating sanctions, governments began discussing incentives. Instead of asking how to isolate Tehran, some policymakers started asking whether cooperation might actually reduce long-term risk. That is a major diplomatic shift, because economics often succeeds where ideology fails. History is full of countries that could not agree politically, but still found ways to cooperate financially. Trade has a unique ability to soften conflicts that military pressure cannot resolve. Iran understands this, and so do its neighbors. If a government believes regional cooperation could generate billions in trade, investment, shipping services, or infrastructure development, it suddenly has another reason to avoid confrontation. This is where America's position becomes more complicated. Washington views any arrangement that expands Iranian regional influence with deep suspicion. From the American perspective, allowing Iran to gain additional economic leverage could reshape the balance of power across the Middle East. That explains why U.S. officials continue emphasizing freedom of navigation and existing international maritime rules. But regional governments are looking at the situation through a different lens. They are asking practical questions. Which option reduces the chance of another war? Which option protects our ports? Which option keeps investors confident? Which option prevents insurance premiums from skyrocketing? These are business calculations, not ideological ones. And governments that depend heavily on trade often prioritize predictable commerce over geopolitical confrontation. This difference in priorities creates friction. Washington still views the region primarily through the language of security. Many Gulf governments increasingly view it through the language of economic stability. Those are not identical objectives. That doesn't mean the Gulf is abandoning the United States. Far from it. Military cooperation continues. Security partnerships remain important. American bases are still there. But today's Middle East is no longer operating under a simple with us or against us framework. Countries are trying to maintain relationships with multiple powers simultaneously. They want American security, Chinese investment, Russian energy cooperation, and manageable relations with Iran. This is what international relations scholars call strategic balancing. Instead of choosing one side permanently, governments spread their risk across several powerful partners. That strategy gives smaller states greater flexibility. It also reduces dependence on any single superpower. And once that balancing process begins, the influence of every major power, including the United States, naturally becomes more limited. That may be the biggest transformation happening beneath the headlines. The region is no longer organizing itself around one dominant center of power. It is gradually adapting to a world where influence is shared, negotiated, and constantly recalculated. And while this transformation was unfolding in the Middle East, another country was quietly benefiting without firing a single missile: Russia. While headlines focused on missiles, ceasefires, and emergency diplomacy, Moscow was playing an entirely different game. Russia didn't need to dominate the news cycle. It only needed the crisis to continue. Because every time instability spreads across the Middle East, one market reacts almost immediately: energy. Oil traders don't wait for wars to end. They react to uncertainty. Even the possibility of disruptions in the Persian Gulf can push prices upward. And when prices climb, Russia benefits almost automatically. Every additional dollar added to the price of a barrel translates into billions of dollars flowing into Russian energy exports over time. That creates a remarkable situation. The longer global markets worry about supply disruptions, the stronger Russia's financial position becomes. Without launching new military operations, without opening another front, without making dramatic announcements. The market does much of the work. But Moscow's strategy extends far beyond higher oil prices. While Washington devoted enormous diplomatic attention to managing the Middle East crisis, Russia quietly accelerated projects that have been under development for years. Transportation corridors, energy infrastructure, industrial cooperation, nuclear technology. These projects rarely dominate television coverage because they lack the drama of military conflict. Yet, they often produce much longer-lasting influence. Consider infrastructure for a moment. A missile can destroy a bridge. A railway can reshape trade patterns for decades. A sanctions package may last a few years. A pipeline can influence political decisions for an entire generation. This is where Russia has invested significant effort. Rather than competing with America everywhere simultaneously, Moscow concentrates on areas where it possesses clear advantages: energy exports, heavy industry, transportation networks, military technology, nuclear expertise. Each new agreement strengthens economic relationships that become increasingly difficult to reverse. Countries connected through pipelines, railways, electricity grids, and long-term industrial contracts naturally develop shared interests. Those interests often survive changes in governments. They even survive periods of political disagreement. That is one reason infrastructure has become one of the most powerful geopolitical tools of the 21st century. And Russia understands that extremely well. Instead of asking how to replace the United States everywhere, Moscow asks a narrower question: where can Russia become indispensable? That is a much easier objective. If one country depends on Russian fertilizer, another depends on Russian energy, another depends on Russian nuclear engineers, another depends on Russian logistics. Together, those relationships create influence that cannot easily be measured by military spending alone. This approach also requires far fewer resources than trying to dominate the entire international system. It is selective, patient, and highly pragmatic. Notice something interesting. Neither Russia nor Iran necessarily needs America to fail completely. They only need Washington to remain distracted. Every additional crisis forces American policymakers to divide their attention. Europe, the Middle East, the Indo-Pacific, domestic politics, economic pressures. Every front demands money. Every front demands diplomacy. Every front demands military planning. That creates an enormous burden. Meanwhile, Russia can focus on a much smaller set of priorities. Concentrated effort often outperforms scattered effort, especially over long periods. But even as Russia quietly expands its influence, another player has adopted an even more patient strategy. A strategy built not around today's crisis, but around the global economy of the next 20 years. That player is China. And unlike everyone else, Beijing appears perfectly comfortable letting others exhaust themselves first. If Russia is quietly profiting from today's crisis, China is preparing to dominate tomorrow's economy. And that difference is critical. Throughout this entire confrontation, Beijing has avoided becoming the loudest voice in the room. No dramatic military deployments, no daily press conferences threatening escalation, no rush to place itself at the center of the conflict. At first glance, that may look like caution. In reality, it may be strategy. Because while the world's attention remained fixed on the Middle East, Chinese leaders were focused somewhere else entirely. Factories, power grids, artificial intelligence, advanced manufacturing, electric vehicles, semiconductors, renewable energy. These are not the headlines that dominate breaking news, but they are the industries that shape global influence over the next 20 years. Think about history. The countries that dominate an era are rarely those fighting the most wars. More often, they are the ones building the industries everyone else eventually depends on. Britain dominated through industrial manufacturing. America rose through technology, finance, and post-war production. China appears determined to write the next chapter using a similar formula. Instead of spending enormous resources trying to police every international crisis, Beijing has concentrated on expanding productive capacity. Every new factory, every logistics hub, every research center, every high-speed railway, every clean energy project adds another layer to China's long-term competitiveness. And while geopolitical tensions consume Washington's attention, Beijing gains something extremely valuable. Time. Time to innovate. Time to export. Time to attract investment. Time to strengthen supply chains. This may be China's greatest strategic advantage. It doesn't have to win every diplomatic confrontation. It only has to continue growing while its competitors remain occupied elsewhere. That is a completely different philosophy of power. Military victories can change borders. Economic ecosystems can change the entire world. Today, Chinese companies manufacture products used in nearly every major economy: solar panels, electric batteries, industrial equipment, consumer electronics, telecommunications hardware. The deeper those supply chains become, the harder they are to replace, and that creates influence without requiring military intervention. Countries may disagree with Beijing politically, yet many still rely heavily on Chinese manufacturing. That dependence creates leverage, not through threats, but through economics. This is why China's response to the Middle East crisis has been remarkably disciplined. Rather than becoming another military actor, Beijing has consistently positioned itself as a supporter of stability, trade, and diplomatic negotiation. Whether one agrees with that position or not, the strategic logic is clear. The less China spends managing conflicts, the more resources remain available for industrial expansion. Compare that with the United States. Washington continues maintaining military commitments across Europe, the Middle East, and the Indo-Pacific. Each commitment requires personnel, equipment, budgets, political attention. China faces challenges of its own, of course. Its economy is slowing in some sectors, demographic pressures remain significant. Property markets have experienced serious difficulties. None of these problems should be ignored. But despite those internal challenges, Beijing continues investing heavily in technologies expected to define the next generation of economic competition. Artificial intelligence, automation, advanced robotics, green energy, quantum research. Those investments are not designed to dominate tomorrow's headlines. They are designed to dominate tomorrow's markets, and that may ultimately prove far more important. History often rewards countries that think decades ahead rather than election cycles ahead. Whether China succeeds remains uncertain. No strategy guarantees victory, but one fact is becoming increasingly difficult to ignore. While much of the world debates today's conflict, China is quietly preparing for tomorrow's economy. And sometimes the quietest player at the table ends up changing the game more than anyone notices. Now, step back for a moment. Forget the daily headlines. Forget the speeches. Forget the social media arguments. When you place every piece of this puzzle on the table, a very different picture begins to emerge. The question is no longer who won the latest exchange. The real question is asterisk, asterisk. Who is quietly improving their position while everyone else is focused on the battlefield? Look at each major player. The United States still possesses the world's strongest military. Its alliances remain extensive. Its financial system continues to influence global markets. No serious analyst should underestimate American power. But power is not measured only by military capability. It is also measured by sustainability. How many simultaneous crises can a country manage? How much debt can it accumulate? How many overseas commitments can it finance? How much political support exists at home for continued global leadership? Those questions matter just as much as aircraft carriers or fighter jets. Iran, despite enormous economic pressure and years of sanctions, has demonstrated something equally important. It has shown that a middle power can complicate the strategy of a superpower without matching its military strength. By combining diplomacy, regional relationships, economic proposals, legal arguments, and asymmetric pressure, Tehran has forced much larger countries to spend enormous amounts of attention and resources. Russia has benefited from higher energy revenues while expanding selective partnerships where its comparative advantages remain strongest, not by replacing the United States everywhere, but by strengthening influence wherever opportunities appear. China has taken perhaps the longest view of all. Instead of trying to dominate today's crisis, it continues investing in tomorrow's industries. Its calculation appears remarkably simple. If competitors remain distracted long enough, the balance of economic power may gradually shift without a direct confrontation ever taking place. Notice something interesting. None of these countries are pursuing identical strategies. They are not moving like members of one unified alliance. Each has its own priorities, its own interests, its own calculations, yet their actions often produce similar outcomes. Every additional challenge facing Washington increases pressure on American resources. Every new regional partnership reduces dependence on a single global power. Every alternative trade route, every infrastructure project, every financial agreement, every diplomatic opening adds another layer to a world becoming increasingly multipolar. That may be the most significant transformation of all, not the rise of one new superpower, but the gradual decline of a system where one nation could shape almost every major international decision. History rarely changes overnight. Empires seldom collapse in a single dramatic moment. More often, influence fades gradually. One disagreement, one negotiation, one economic partnership, one diplomatic adjustment at a time. Then, years later, people look back and realize the turning point had already passed long before anyone recognized it. Perhaps that is what we are witnessing today. Not the end of American power, but the beginning of a world where power is distributed differently than it was just a generation ago. Whether that transition produces greater stability or greater competition remains one of the defining questions of our time. Because the next decade may not be decided by the country that fires the most missiles, it may be decided by the country that builds the strongest economy, the deepest partnerships, and the most resilient long-term strategy. That is the bigger story unfolding beneath today's headlines, and it is one worth watching very carefully. If you enjoyed this analysis, let me know what you think in the comments. Do you believe the global balance of power is truly shifting, or is this only a temporary geopolitical adjustment? I'd genuinely like to hear your perspective. And if you enjoy long-form geopolitical analysis that looks beyond the headlines, consider subscribing. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.